good evening again. I'm hoping most people are back and will be getting back soon. I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to keep going. I hope you've had a little bit of refreshment. So in part 2 now of our talk, I'm going to start putting this all together and then start looking at how we make that practical when we're working with young people. And I'm hoping that even if you've worked with a lot of these concepts a lot in your life, that even doing this exercise, looking at yourself at all those different areas might have lighted up one or two things. Oh, okay, I didn't think about this in myself, or I haven't actually put myself exactly here within the spectrum. So what happens is that when we start looking at human beings and sexuality, we all sit in different places. So for example, we have if you think of all these little blue dots on this lovely table here are all different people. And at the top here, we've got how you experience your sexual desire. So remember, we talked about spontaneous desire, which is here on the left. So people who have a high level of spontaneous desire often have sexual thoughts. And those with responsive desire, where they need a context before they might have sexual desire. Some people, when they get physically intimate and close to somebody, they really like the sex side of it. They easily get turned on. Orgasm quite often arises as a possible option for a great time. And then there are some people where they really love the cuddling and the touching and the chatting and the what they call romance, but I'm not just talking about romance in terms of the build up in a relationship. I'm talking about the physical side of attraction. So with all of us, we're sitting somewhere on this possible, and you can have every possible combination of how that would look in different people. And what's of course lovely is it can change. So teenage boys will definitely start here, but then as men grow older in their 40s or 50s, they might even move more and more towards actually wanting more of that cuddling, kissing, holding hands side also in the relationship, and that might suddenly become more important. And even some of them might have more and more responsive desire and less spontaneous desire as they grow older. So now I want to give a scenario. It's a very binary scenario, but I think it's still helpful because it's one of those archetypal one that you see in all this always classic soap opera scenario. So I want you to imagine it's matric after party, and we've got two teenagers. Let's make them 18 just to make it less complicated. And we're going to assume that they've been together for a while, and tonight's the night to have sex, because that's what you do, like proms, matric farewells, I don't know, decide to get a go of it. And our guy here is going to sit on this side of the spectrum. So he's got a high level of spontaneous desire, often have sexual fantasies, sexual thoughts, masturbates like all healthy young boys should be doing. And our girl happens to be sitting over here in the bottom right-hand corner. So she's got a high level of responsive desire. So remember, this doesn't mean that she doesn't feel. She feels, and she feels an awful lot. She's got extremely high levels of attraction, but it's that oxytocin-driven reaction. It's the swooning, oh my God, this is so wonderful kind of attraction. And when she loves the cuddling, the kissing, the hand-holding, etc. But now they haven't had a decent sex education like most of us, and therefore these concepts are fairly unclear, and now they're making out on the couch. And they've both decided that this is now going to go towards sex. And so what the guy's experiencing is he's already horny, and he has a very high level of testosterone, keeping that sexual desire high. She's completely flushed with oxytocin and all excited, and it's all wonderful. But she's never experienced much sexual desire. She might have had the odd thing, but she doesn't really know what to call it. She's never masturbated. She has a very strong feeling of attraction, but she doesn't know what sexual desire is. And nobody has given her a name for what she's experiencing. So she's watched all the movies, and she knows tonight's supposed to be the night. And so she's assuming what she's experiencing is sexual desire, and that they're now going to have sex. And then you have the classic, you know, in the movies when the guy's like hand starts creeping up the leg, you know, up the skirt. And of course, if she's still sitting here, her genitals are not awake yet, and she does not have any desire to be touched there yet. And so she suddenly has a physical experience of, I don't like that, or I don't want that. But it's contradictory, because in her mind, this is now where they're supposed to go. The guy also assumes that she's having massively high levels of sexual desire. And of course, all the guy wants is somebody to grab his dick, and he's assuming she's exactly the same place. And so we suddenly have this translation issue. So there's a couple of things that can happen. So at this point, She can listen to her body and close off and go, no, actually, no, I don't like that. And then that causes a lot of confusion on both sides. She's now worried that there's something wrong with her. He's like worried, well, why is she now being like that? She's been giving him cues all evening. They've planned this for ages. The other thing that happens is that she goes, no, this is fine. You know, she just ignores what she's experiencing, and they push through to sex, and he's not able to listen in and realize she's not there yet. And she has a sexual experience which does not quite feel like what she's seen in the movies, because she wasn't actually awake yet to start having sex. Sexual desire hadn't kicked in yet, although it probably would have eventually if the boy was a little bit more experienced. So with that, you have all these things that we always hear in the world of sex, which is what I'm calling this lost in translation. So boys who sit here, we're saying, oh, men only want one thing. Slut shaming, if you've got a girl who's got high spontaneous desire and who does like having sex and is quite comfortable with going out and having sex without too much emotional connection, that they get called names. If a girl pulls back where she seems to be giving signals, she gets called a cock teaser. There gets a lot of negotiation, but if you like me, then surely you would be sexually attracted to me. And feelings of inadequacy on both sides when things are not working. And this is largely to do with us just not having given our children the correct language to talk about sex. So when we look at sexual diversity, we'll see that sexual pleasure is affected by all kinds of things. Kind of sexual desire we have, the kind of bodily pleasure we like, depends on our age, what life phase we are in, what circumstances is going on in our life. It depends on the kind of relationship we're having, our sexual orientation. Are we attracted to men or women? Are we emotionally or physically attracted? Who is my gender identity? What is my medical and mental health stuff that's going on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So whenever two people are getting into a sexual relationship, you have these two sexual beings who have got all these different things going on. And it's absolutely extraordinary that people think they can just fall into bed and will just work. If you haven't brought some sage conversation to actually, this is where I'm at, and oh, tell me about where you're at before you fall into the bed, there is extraordinarily risk of things going wrong. So for healthy sex, we need to be able to understand and accept our own sexuality. We need to understand and accept our partner's sexuality. We need to be able to have a communication about who we are and who they are. I am a huge thing around consent. So sex is not a compromise. It's not, well, I don't like this, but I do like that. Can we do? It's all about finding where the common ground is. We know and both need to be able to fully consent to what is going to happen and how it's going to happen. And if there's stuff that your partner's not particularly into, fantasy and masturbation can take care of the rest. So it's a little bit how we create that communication spaces. So now we actually get to how do we translate it into our sex education curriculum. So you feel free to go and look up the Pleasure Project. It's got these lovely principles of how we talk about sex, which is all about positivity, rights, flexibility, embrace learning, love yourself. It's a beautiful philosophy around and very evidence-based in how to better talk about sex to others. But we think in terms of development and what we do at the different ages of our different children. So as I've mentioned, in the littlies under 9 don't have an internal experience of sex yet. And so quite often they don't ask about sex and sex does not occur to them. And quite often all our pictures about where you come from is based on their spiritual heritage rather than their physical heritage. So we have those lovely stories in kindergarten, which is all about where how the astral body and the ego organization arrived, and it's not so much about how the physical body came into being. From a sex education point of view, our focus up until the age of 8, 9 is obviously throughout education, but the most important thing is developing what we call a strong will in the world of Waldorf. I'm going to break it into grit. So being able to fulfill what you want in your life. There's a lovely book regarding grit. Ooh, I should get the reference for you, where she talks about grit as something called passion in combination with perseverance. And how do we grow grit in our children? Waldorf's very good at that. How do we create body positivity in our children, no matter what their bodies are or where their bodies are at, and for them to feel that we are positive about how they present. and of course, self-confidence. So these things you don't grow through teaching children through concepts. You grow it through the way you structure your curriculum. I'm not going to cover that here. This is all the stuff you guys know. I do have a talk on an introduction to Waldorf education to parents, where I talk a little bit about grit and what we do in kindergartens to help grow a strong will. So for a child to have a healthy sexual relationship, they need to be able to maintain their own boundaries. They need to know, what do I like? What do I not like? And be able to be assertive of what those boundaries are. So for a person to be able to give consent, they need a strong will. And to be able to negotiate these things. So those are the bases as we lie, but we're not yet talking about sex. Once the child is 10 years old, as I've said, we need to start introducing some concepts. So ideally, parents should talk to children about sex. They're the ones that should tell children about the penis-vagina episode, obviously in a much wider context. But we can't assume that this happens in every household. So it's certainly helpful to meet with parents if you've got quite a sophisticated parent group, but don't make assumptions. In some cultures, and depending on people's own sexual backgrounds, they might be more or less comfortable to talk about sex, and no parent has ever been trained on how to appropriately broach the subject. So so it's very useful to have those workshops with our parents. But you need to get a feeling for your class, and you need to find ways to include certain concepts in some of your main lessons. So very important, there needs to be some talk about the bodily changes of puberty, especially around the variety. You know, some kids start breast early, some start later, it's all fine. Some grow first, some grow later, it's all fine. The concept of sex has to be covered somehow. So there's different ways of doing it. It almost never quite works to talk about sex in the large class group because they're all at such different phases of understanding. So looking at small groups, looking at boys and girls separately, you'll have to look at your own class, but you need to make sure your children, that an adult is explained to the child what sex is. Otherwise, they're going to hear it from a buddy, or they're going to see it on a movie, or they're going to read it somewhere odd and strange. But very important already during these years, and on the next slide, I'll show you a little bit how we do that. We want to have these concepts. What do we mean with a gender identity? What is a transgendered person? What do we mean with sexual orientation? What is gender expression? And be able to normalize these concepts. So for the child who discovers they are gay, that this is a normal part of how we understand human diversity. For the child who is transgender, that they're able to name what they're actually experiencing. And these concepts that I've just brought of sexual desire and physical attraction, we need to talk about this. We need to be able to explain, when we talk about the great romances and the great stories, what is desire and what is physical attraction. So of course, at this age group, we don't want to do this like a biology lesson, right? This is not going to be a life science thing like we will do with the older kids. And we'll do it classically Waldorf style, which is we use ways to strengthen the dynamics of children and the emotional intelligence of children we do around stories. So all of our main lessons, especially our history main lessons, our literature main lessons, is structured around understanding the great stories of whatever main lesson block you are carrying. And within all of the big, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans or the Indians or whatever you're covering, there are great love stories that has all kinds of components in it. Obviously, when we do the stories, we simply let the children live into the stories. But later, when you reflect on some of these concepts, you can bring those stories to mind to explain some of these concepts that we are talking about. So, for example, when you are doing your Greeks, there's some beautiful stories in terms of homosexuality within the Greek culture. In the Roman culture, there's Emperor Hadrian, an Antinous, beautiful love story of a young man who died unfortunately quite young, and this emperor actually had him deified after his death. There's a story of James Barry, amazing medical doctor, British medical doctor, but who actually worked in Cape Town for many years. He was born Margaret Ann Kelly, but lived his whole life as a man. He was one of the first, he went up very high in the British military as a medical doctor. I think he was the second highest post or whatever, and did the first ever cesarean section in Africa where the woman and the child both survived. And they only discovered that he was assigned female at birth at his post-mortem. It's one of those lovely stories. So of course, Emily Dickinson, when you're doing literature, with her lovely love letters to her gay partner, and of course the story of Oscar Wilde when we're covering some of his writings. So Some of those are obviously in the older class 7, 8. James Barry is sort of industrial revolution time. But you can find, no matter what main loss and block you can say, you can consciously incorporate stories that incorporates all of this diversity of different sexual beings. Now, once the teenage years, we now can start doing biology. The child is now got very much their nerve sense development has been freed from their feeling realm. We're now able to do concepts and quite abstract things. And of course, and I'm sure this you do, you're covering all your sexual health stuff, contraception, STIs, HIV, etc. Got to talk about reproduction and pregnancy. But very important, and I'm sure this is there, is talking around sexual rights and the history of sexual rights and these concepts of sexual diversity. What I'd like you to add to your curriculum, if it's not already there, is how do we strengthen the sage in this relationship? So we've talked about the fact that your 14-year-old are still very much in this, it's got this very fully developed endocrine system, and they've come into their sexuality. So for your boys at 14, 15, a lot of them, this might mean strong spontaneous desire, lots of erections, lots of sexual fantasies. They have arrived as sexual beings. And it's the same for the girls. So a 14-year-old girl, just because she's got responsive sexual desire and might have a very strong physical attraction built around oxytocin, doesn't mean that she's still a young and immature sexual being. She's come into herself, and that is the way she presents. She has strong physical attraction to the opposite sex or to the same sex. She has a strong feeling of wanting to be intimate with a partner, physically intimate. She swoons every time the kiss happens in the movies. And she has a very strong experience within her own body of sensual and physical attraction. So those are both valid ways of experiencing love and attraction. And we're not going to wait until we're 21 to now actually enter into relationships. So they're already starting to enter into relationships and have these few years where the sage is still a bit young and still developing. And how do we help them use some of the skills and capabilities they have to create a nice, safe development for this lovely, vibrant chimp who just wants to get down and dirty. So the gender taboo, that lovely, it's a wonderful thing to do with our teenagers. It's a lovely thing you can actually do every now and then because things change over the years. You can say to them, remember we did this a year ago, why don't we do it again this year? And you can see where you're at. It always has to be private, so the child does their own gender taboo. And then I encourage children to then find somebody that they'd be willing to go and talk to about their gender taboo. So it can be a parent at home, it can be a friend, it can be a teacher, but that they start being able to firstly reflect on themselves, this is who I am, and then being able to describe it to somebody else. But they need to be free when and how to do it. And you certainly don't want to do that in the classroom setting because it's still quite a personal thing, this getting to know yourself. But we want to have them the ability to start describing to somebody else who I am and being able to listen to somebody else and understand who somebody else is and start noticing those differences. As they get older, you can actually have role play and discussions around sex. And for me, one of the great, we always complain about all the media and all the Netflix series, and you can find out what are my kids watching at the moment, what series is everybody into. Every single thing you watch on television has got great examples of how sexual relationships work or rather not work. So you can look quite often and say, well, have you noticed Grey's Anatomy, my classic example? Everybody in Grey's Anatomy has got spontaneous desire and seems to just go for orgasm, right? That's the way it works. Boy sees girl and then they burst through the on-call room and then that's where it goes. There's no space for the fact that actually there might be different ways in how people want to sexually relate, and there's no conversation around sex at all. So you can use media and reflect on media by using the gender taboo to understand these different dynamics. Working with body positivity in the classroom, consciously, and in the way we just treat each other's bodies in terms of shapes and sizes. I'm very strongly talking about consent and working with consent and looking at consent and how it's this idea of compromise in sex is a basic taboo, terrible word, taboo. To get away from this idea that you have to give a little in sex, especially for our girls. So there's this tendency to feel I need to please, and therefore, even if something is not comfortable, even if that's not what I like, I can't communicate why I don't like it, but I'll go along with it anyway. Remember, the point of sex is supposed to be pleasure. We can all find ways to negotiate pleasure that everybody has a great time. We cannot have a scenario where one person is feeling uncomfortable or even feeling violated for somebody else's pleasure. This is very important, and we'll chat a bit about this in a minute, is the ability to have access to professionals or experts to provide guidance. So in the schools that I was in, so I worked, we had this, we called them how to listen, not to talk clinics on a Monday, and me and a nurse was there for 2 hours, and the children were allowed to come and see us for confidential appointments. We gave contraception, and I'd give it condoms and it's pregnancy testing and stuff like that. But a lot of the times they'll also just come and ask us stuff, and they had access to us and they knew it was fully confidential. So being able for children to know they have somebody they can go and talk to, who they can ask questions, and who they can discuss things with, the lights are back on, makes it possible for them to actually, when they want to figure out how they're going to do something, that they've got somebody that they can go and see. So I had a wonderful experience when I was at Wynstones School. So we were doing the sex education. I was doing workshops myself with the older kids. We was working with the class teachers with the younger kids. And we used to have sexual health clinics at the school where kids could also book me for confidential appointments. They like to come in gangs, like 3 or 4 girls, and then they have like questions they've written down. It was very fun. And then when I was in my practice, I was linked to the anthroposophical practice, linked to the school. I had 2 17-year-olds coming to see me. They were in grade 11. They were a couple. They'd been together for 6 months or so, very committed to each other. And they decided that they wanted to have sex. They were going to move their relationship up a notch. And they came and saw me to talk about contraception. And I think in all my years, they're one of the very few times where I've had a couple coming to see me to talk about contraception. And it was 17-year-olds. And for me, that was amazing. This is now a sage gesture towards us looking, we're going to enter a sex relationship and we want to make sure we are safe. We want to look at our options. We want to understand the different things that are out there. And then being able to prepare them by using your gender taboo, for example, around understanding how to communicate about sex. I mean, that's the dream. That's where we want young adults to be by the time they leave school. And how do we create that culture in the way we teach them? Oh, I'm not doing too badly on time. Okay. So my last few slides is just around looking at the broader issues that's going on around institutions. And when you look at sex education goals, I'm not going to brainstorm them because I'm sure we're going to come up with the same things. When you ask people, what do they want the outcome to be of a sex education curriculum, it's always the same things. We want children to be able to give full consent. We don't want children to feel pressurized into sex. They must go for sex when they feel ready. We want them to be having sex in healthy, respectful, caring relationships. We want them to use contraception. We want them to be careful with HIV. We want them to plan their pregnancies. We want them to feel confident and comfortable in their bodies. And we want them to love sex, right? So we have all these sex ed goals. Everybody has this. If you talk to parents, if you talk to schools, if you talk to the Department of Education, we all know where we want to get with our sex education. And lovely, this is the definition from the Global Advisory Board on Sexual Pleasure. And you can see when we talk about sexual pleasure, we do have words like self-determination, consent, safety, privacy, confidence. Those are all sage qualities that we want to bring to sexual pleasure. But what's happening in practice is when we try and set up sex education curriculums, we bring chimp mechanisms. So I'm just going to illustrate what happens in the local school here. And I'm sure that this is not as extreme, but this is what happens in your normal education in terms of sex education. We're using rules, taboos, admonitions, culture, or religion to try and control our children's sexuality. So we have these lovely, almost sage goals for our children's development. But what we do is we try and control sexuality by having uniform rules, by having hair rules, and by having appearance rules. Oh, just realized I might run out of battery. Just plugging in. So we have all these lovely rules about how much skin you must show. And okay, some of it is to do with trying to control our children's chimps in general, make them more compliant, which doesn't actually work. But certainly a lot of the rules around uniform and hair is about making our children less sexual, right? So it would be interesting to look in the Waldorf School when we were at Wynstones. We went through a strappy top war where the girls were all wearing these strappy tops, you know, the nice, like, you know, on the gym field with the nice bobbing boobs. And then you have to start wondering, what's interesting is when you set these rules to try and control sexuality, is when you then try and have a debate or a conversation about it with teenagers, the debate never works because it's fear-based, it's chimp-based, it's not evidence-based. You can't actually have a rational argument around uniform rules. It's just a way for us to try and control something that feels uncontrollable. In some of the schools, in our school, we once had a priest do a talk to the kids about taboos around masturbation. I threw a small fit around that. But there's quite often when I was at school in grade 7, we had a dominee that came and talked to us about, you know, never ever hug a boy, because once a boy has felt a breast against his chest, he'll never be the same again. You know how tempting that is to teenage girls. But there's these taboos that gets brought around fondling or around all kinds of activity that might lead to sex. And what we see, and this is a big debate at the moment in the schools, we as a health department want condoms in all the bathrooms, but there's this idea if there's no access to condoms or contraception or pregnancy testing, then they won't have sex. And when you look at the sex education curriculum, it's all focused on dangers, risks, all the negative aspects of sex. And there's this fear, if we can just put the living fear into our children, they won't have sex. Of course, we have all the evidence now that shows none of these things work. They certainly don't contribute, and in some cases, they can actually make things worse. And none of these strategies creates a sexually intelligent adult, which is what we are trying to do. So if we bring a sage consideration to our sex education curriculum, then we want to look in sexual health, sexual pleasure, sexual rights, again, those threefold part of the human being, from a bodily level, from a sexual health level. We want them to be able to have access to contraception, condoms, and good information, a healthcare professional. In Holland, for example, there's this term double Dutch. They put the girls on the pill and condoms, and you know, there's a huge drive around, they've got the lowest teenage pregnancy rate in the world. Sweden, which has a legal age for sex at 12 and has got the most, I would say, open and liberal sex education curriculum in Europe, also have the latest COITAC, the latest age where kids start sex. It's an average of 17 or 18 before children start having sex. So we now know that the more you give them access to information, so the more they bring their sage to the conversation, the less likely the chimp's going to take over and get himself into trouble. We've talked a lot about helping to build our children's sexual intelligence, using gender taboo and communication skills in our curriculums. And then I wanted to say a few things about gender affirmation and freedom of expression and protection of all these different gender diverse children. So this is out of an amazing, and I'll show you my guideline in a minute, but out of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Children's Act, and the South African Schools Act. This is in one of our new guidelines on gender affirmation for transgender communities, talking about schools must ensure an inclusive, non-discriminatory, and diversity affirming environment. So I want to do a quick poll. Sorry, just going to find it, to about gender, just because I don't want to preach to the converted, and you guys might already be completely on board with all of this. So I'm just going to check what's happening on trans. So when I mean TGD friendly policies, I mean transgender and gender diverse children in your school. So my first question there is, if you know, so for you as a teacher and from your perspective, wherever you're sitting, do you know how many transgender or gender diverse children there are at Michael Mount School? So from what you've seen or known or heard, how many do you think there are at your school? And then your second question is does your school have a policy around the needs of transgender and gender diverse children? Okay, great. We've got lots of input there. Thank you. So good. It looks like there's at least 5 to 10 kids at your school that fits into those categories. Not everybody's all aware of, so some people are not aware if there's any. It depends a bit on which class you're in. If you've got quite a few kids in your own class, you're going to be much more aware of it than you're in a different class. But what makes transgender kids interesting is it's not like gay children or, so let's use homosexuality as an example, where kids can hide it and decide when they want to come out. Transgender children, when they decide to come out, everybody knows. So in our school, for example, when you obviously, you've got your girls and your boy uniforms. So if somebody was assigned female at birth now applies to wear the boy's uniform, everybody in school knows that that child is trans. So it's much more visible than our gay population. And that's what makes them so vulnerable. You've got this big sign on the front of your head, is I am different than other people. So in terms of school policy, so most of you are not sure if you do have a policy, and some of you don't think there's a policy at all. Thank you very much for giving us that information. So it seems like this is quite relevant at all. There you go. So I just want to make you aware of a guideline that's brought out in the medical side, because we're concerned about our transgender population as being a very high risk population. They've got higher levels of HIV, higher levels of mental illness, and it's largely due to the fact that there is too much phobia, transphobia, and social exclusion happening in schools, in clinics. So our transgender people are not accessing care because they don't feel safe to come to our clinics. And so they're not getting condoms, they're not getting contraception, they're not getting pre-exposure prophylaxis. So in healthcare, there's an amazing guideline that's come out. I'm not going to run through all those terms, brought out by the South African HIV Clinician Society. I'm doing a lot of trainings on this at the moment, looking at what we call gender affirmation. Gender affirmation is when you make the transgender child feel comfortable and welcome and affirm their gender identity. And the biggest thing for you as schools is to start looking at, do we have a policy on how do we make a transgender child feel safe at our school? And that is called gender affirmation. And I'm going to share with you the document on the guidelines, and it has a lovely chapter on gender affirmation. And it includes several areas. So the first area of gender affirmation has to do just using the name the child prefers. I'm sure you guys are good at this. Using the pronoun the child prefers. One of the ways of doing it is allowing the child or encouraging the child to actually wear a badge with their pronouns on it, and children getting used to using each other's pronouns that is appropriate, and being willing for them to obviously wear whatever. So for example, you don't have hair rules that are boys' hair rules and girls' hair rules. There are hair rules, and the child can choose if you have hair rules, and the child can comply regardless of what sex they were assigned at birth. Psychological, we're trying in medicine to create a lot of support, obviously, for our transgender communities. Quite often these kids get thrown out by their parents, they get rejected by their communities, they get rejected by their churches, and they are very, very vulnerable. So creating a safe space for them at school is very important. I'm not going to talk about the medical side at all. This is in terms of using hormone therapy and things to make adults feel more comfortable. And it's a whole nother chapter around children who are trans. And then the legal things, which is all about changing your ID and changing your name, your gender marker in your ID. So there's an amazing guideline. It's got an amazing guidance on policies for schools to look at how you can have a gender affirmation document about how you look after and make your children, your TGG kids, safe in your school environment. I should have had more time for discussion, but we do have a little bit of time for discussion. Apologies for rushing through those last few slides. The discussion, I just wanted us to open the discussion, and I would like people to just speak out. You can either put your hand up or just unmute around the direction for sex education in your school, or around some of these, your sort of sexual variety, your gender diverse kids in your school. In terms of where you are at with building policies or building sex education curriculums and policies for your school, just to hear a little bit where Michael Mount is at the moment.
I'm happy to start.
Yes.
Cecilia and Madeleine Muller. I think we're very behind, but then again, I do speak as a primary school teacher where it's still, I'm learning. I mean, I only know about this stuff because I have a 17-year-old daughter who tries to get me with it, to educate me, because I'm like a dinosaur in her eyes. But I do know, like our younger teachers in the high school, Jacqueline, Antoinette, they are far more on top of it. And yeah, and I'm so grateful that they're high school teachers, because I feel I'm really in the dark. It's moving so fast, and I need more of this. I need to understand what's coming and get more progressive. And so, yeah, I almost feel like we need you to come to us and help us put this policy together and do even to bring I would love for you to come and even to do the reproduction main lesson with our class 10s, to bring a different slant to it. Or yeah, I think you just need to come to Joburg, you and Tom, and bring Barbara while you're at
it. So I'm very passionate about, I love working with the kids, but what's really fun to do is then to train you guys up as teachers. So what we actually need to do is train you up as a teacher body. Because what I find is when I used to do the teaching at Wynstones is I'll go and do the lesson, that's all very fine. You do a lovely main lesson or whatever, and you do a little set on something. And then they'll come and see me a week later with the questions. So when you do these things, things come up for kids, and then they need adults to be able to come and talk to, and helping to train you guys up and get yourselves more confident to talk about this. And then the other big group to do workshops with, and this might be more worthwhile if I did come up to Joburg, is doing workshop with your parents. So I quite find the biggest thing that determines our policies are the parents getting terrified. Don't talk to my children about sex. Don't put condoms in the bathrooms. You can't have a unisex bathroom. Don't encourage my transgender child. So you have this extraordinary fear. So you're meeting that chimp out in your parent communities who are terrified for their children. They're all terrified about sex. And they don't know how to manage it. So they're all bringing in all these taboos and rules. And we know how unsafe that makes our children feel and makes things a lot worse. So how we build these conversations with our parents is very important as well.
Yeah, definitely.
I think what I've liked so much is this discussion around the sage and bringing in that responsibility as to, looking at sexuality, or, the desire being one thing and then two aspects on the outside. And I mean, Leanne, you're so generous, but I think we've got a long way to go in the high school before we even materialize anything that looks as positive as this does in terms of sex ed. I think, we have, Jacqueline and I potentially have conversations with the kids, but they're not in class. And it isn't, so it would be really, really good to have more parental parents on board, I think. And I love the language. The language is so beautiful. Thank you, because it brings it into a light that is anthroposophical, but as well as relatable. So I think this has been really motivating. Thank you.
Very good. And really, I think one of the ways forward at the moment is, actually have a way forward slide, is just go home, do the gender taboo. I'm going to send you the thing. Do the gender taboo on yourself. Again, go through it, fill in all the little arrows. Do it with whoever you're in an intimate relationship with, physical relationship with. If you are, if you don't have somebody, that's also fine. Then you just do it with yourself, and then communicate it to somebody. So if you're in a relationship with somebody, tell somebody about everything on that chart and get the other person to explain his chart or her chart to you. And if you are a single person, describe your sexuality to a friend using the gender taboo. So that is already an exercise we need to be able to do for ourselves before we're going to teach our kids how to do it. Then you look at your curriculum. Okay, I'm teaching this class. These are the main lessons I'm booking. Am I thinking about bringing examples of romance and sex and talking about romance and sex in the context of the stories I tell every single day? I don't have to make some special weird little special, we're now going to have the sex ed lesson. It can all happen in the main lesson. And then the next step is now looking at our policies. What do we do if a kid comes out that's TGD? We have a local school, a boys' school in East London, one of those traditional boys' schools. And they've had some kids coming out as transgender girls. So boys' schools can respond in many different ways to that kind of scenario. And what they've done is they've had an amazing teacher who's created something called the Gender Identification Club. And they've created toilets specifically for the transgender kids. They've created transgender friendly policies. they've made transgender friendly uniforms, and they are allowing transgender girls in a boys' school. So that's what's possible if we are just somebody to champion in how we actually think and look at policies for when our transgender kids start. And now you're right, if you go into the media, if you go into Netflix series, there's how many non-binary characters, transgender characters are coming in the fore. Kids go, oh, okay, now I understand what's going on for me. And suddenly for the first time they have language. So before, you're going to start seeing more and more kids going, I am non-binary, I would like you to use these pronouns, I'm changing my name. And we need to be ready to how we actually help these kids feel safe. In the past, these are the kids who end up with anxiety disorders. These are the kids who end up committing suicide. These are the kids who end up with eating disorders. These are the kids who end up self-harming. So it's not that these kids haven't existed. It's just for the first time they've got language of things that they are experiencing, and they're going to come and tell us about it. And we need to be ready.
Can I say?
Yes, please.
I know it's late. So sorry for being late.
No problem at all. Yes.
Maybe what I have to say is it's like really obvious, but I'm teaching class 4, and this exact thing is happening, that they have the language, but absolutely no understanding. So we had a situation, there's a child, I'm also quite new, so I don't know all the children, but a child who was doing the Greek Olympics who I think is trans in some way, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure because my children weren't sure. And they were telling me, but they were defending that. They were saying, no, Ms. Higgins, you can't call the child her because he was born he. So he wants to be her, but you can't. So they've completely shifted because they know that they're supposed to be angry about this thing. And they're already only 9 years old. And so it was so clear to me how important it is to have that. And especially now in class 4, one of the big things that I think happens developmentally, not at all to do with sex and any of that, want to be called by code names and names. It's a whole class 4 thing, and it just opens up more opportunity to have, I'm going to actually be a he or whatever. And yeah, so to really start it now down here, thank you for emphasizing that as well.
And the guideline is amazing. It's beautifully written. They've got this concept called trans-giftedness, because what you are seeing is a very strong experience of the identity of the ego organization being not aligned with the physical body. It's quite an extraordinary thing. And for most trans kids to be able to live their truth, it takes quite something. To come out as trans is not easy. You're not stepping into a world that's going to open their arms to you. And for some of them, they get absolutely rejected by their families and their peer groups. And as a trans kid, you're coming out every single bloody day. You go to the movies, and which bathrooms do you use? You go to a school event, you go to an inter-school event, you go to a party, you are constantly dealing with this and having to explain to people and having to hear people's, everybody has a bloody chimp comment, when they first come across a trans person, they have to say something stupid. So it's very, very hard for these children. And school is the one place where we can perhaps create a safe place. Yeah. I've put in the chat there an evaluation form. I'm also going to send it via email. I realized my poll was too limited. And I would love you guys, you can either click on it now, but we'll send it on email as well, to just give us feedback on both workshops, to also look at what we can do in the future, how you would like us to build on that, what else you need. I like your idea of the videos. So I create I've got YouTube channels, and I'll send you all my videos. I'm doing a lot of trainings for doctors at the moment on gender affirmation and TGD for the HIV Clinician Society, etc. And some of those resources are quite nice because they're medical and they're evidence-based, and you try and get away from the ethical moral conversation and just get to the key population looking after diversity conversation. And I'm very happy to make those available. And we'll slowly, there's amazing resources for TGD communities out there. There's amazing online groups available out there. And I'll try and put those together in a nice, easy resource for you guys. So great. So we'll look at the videos. Okay, so If the adult does not accept the child's trans identity, so it's similar if an adult refuses to accept a child as gay, it's similar if the child wants to go and study art, but the parent wants the child to go and do medicine. You have lots of scenarios where what the child's identity wants to do gets suppressed because of the parents' expectations or ideas. And with trans, it can get quite dramatic. We're very much talking so much about having a multidisciplinary team should be involved. So you as a school can obviously meet with the family and say, let's involve the team, and then just find out who your local social worker, psychologist, and hopefully transgender facility. So WITS RHI does run a transgender facilities and services, gender affirming services in Johannesburg, and they're very good at this. So the idea is you obviously want to get the parents on board as much as possible, and a lot of their focus will be on educating the parent. This is a biological thing. This is how it works. This is the terms. This is what happens. This is what's happened to other children. This is how many children we have in the program. These are the options. It's going to go through a lot of counseling and informed consent before we do anything. And I think what most people don't realize is not doing anything for your child who is trans or trying to force them to be cisgendered has got extraordinary mental health consequences. And that's not seen. We see very high suicide rates in our trans kids that are not accepted. We see high self-harm. We see high substance abuse. So doing nothing or trying to pretend it's not happening or not helping the child can do extraordinary harm. So as a school, how do we facilitate those processes? Thank you very much for the feedback. I'm very glad to hear it feels like it's something that's helpful to where your school is at the moment. And I'm very helpful. Yes, I will send around both the gender taboo, and also I'll put together a pack with the presentations that you guys can use to teach yourself. So you can use these slides to teach the adolescents. You can use these slides to go through gender taboo with your teenagers, et cetera, et cetera. And when you have a discussion with your teenagers, God, they know all this terminology. You ask them what transgender, non-binary, and gender fluid, and demi-boy, and the whole lot, and they will, yeah, there's a lot of understanding in our younger people. And we all have to catch up. Hey, great. Any last questions or comments? I know we've slightly over time. Need to learn how to make these shorter. Okay, great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Madeleine. And please tell us when you're doing something more.
Yeah, so I'm going to, from here on, I'm going to look a little bit at what you guys need as well. So this term, I'm focusing on these two particular topics that are close to my heart. And there's things like doing child studies and school readiness and the will and the senses, and there's all kinds of good old-fashioned stuff we can do in the future as well. And we can build a little bit depending on the need. And the big question is also how you guys find this platform. I mean, it's always lovely to come out to Joburg, but this makes it very doable to create workshops that's easily accessible without huge logistical arrangements.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Madeleine.
Good night, everybody. Go and have some supper.
Good night. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.